story of Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, Candlemass debut album that created a genre called epic doom metal. But let's take it from the beginning. It all started with bassist and then vocalist Leif Edling, who had a band called Witchcraft. Witchcraft recorded a demo in 1981. The following year, Leif formed another band called Nemesis, together with Anders Wallin, Kristian Weberyd and Anders Waltersson. Nemesis then released an EP in 1984 called The Day of Retribution, with Leif Edling not only playing the bass but also doing the vocals. Soon after the release of their EP, Nemesis split up. In 1985, Leif then decided to form yet another band. This time they would name themselves Candlemass. The first ever Candlemass lineup consisted of Leif Edling on bass and vocals, Matz Ekström on drums, and guitarist Kristian Weberyd, who was also a member of Nemesis. In another part of town, Matz Björkman was getting back to playing guitar again, after quitting music altogether after his departure from the band ATC, short for Above the Clouds, a heavy metal band that released the LP Cut in Ice in 1984. Candlemass drummer Matz Ekström were friends with guitarist Matz Björkman, also known as Mappe. They were jamming together one day and Matz invited Mappe to come to the Stockholm suburb of Upplands Väsby to jam with a friend who owned a bass guitar. That bass player was of course Leif Edling. Leif showed Mappe the song Crystal Ball, which was so different from the type of heavy metal that he had played with ATC. Upon leaving the rehearsal room, Mappe felt like there was something there, something to build on, even if their sound at the time wasn't very polished. Mappe was at the time into 70s bands such as UFO, Uriah Heep and Black Sabbath, but he was quite unaware of the wave of bands that were starting to make their mark on the mid-80s metal scene. Chicago's doom metal band Trouble quickly became one of the main influences for the newly formed Candlemass, after the band heard the song The Last Judgment, which was on the compilation album Metal Massacre 4 from 1983. Leif became the band's main songwriter, and he came up with riffs and lyrics for the band, who at the time were rehearsing songs like Crystal Ball, Demon's Gate and Under the Oak. Mappe's first recording with Candlemass was a 2-track demo that consisted of Demon's Gate and the brand new Blackstone Wielder. The demo was recorded to showcase some material to the French label Black Dragon, a label that had Manila Road signed to them, one of Candlemass' main influences besides Black Sabbath, Trouble and Angel Witch. It stood clear that Candlemass needed a vocalist. Leif, who sung for Nemesis, wasn't interested in fronting the band, but it was hard for Candlemass to find any decent vocalists that were even interested in joining the band, simply because Candlemass were kind of outsiders on the Swedish metal and hard rock scene due to their heavy style. The local scene at the time was dominated by more commercial hair bands such as Europe and Treat. Candlemass then signed a deal with Black Dragon Records, so now was a good time to find a vocalist and a guitarist that could play the lead parts. The band were on a tight budget, so they settled on the Thunderload Studios when looking for a place to record their debut album. Thunderload Studios was a rehearsal room with studio equipment, and it was owned by Ragne and Styrbjörn Wahlquist from the legendary heavy metal band Heavy Load. The former would act as a recording engineer and co-producer on the album. Despite the metal scene being quite small, the guys in Candlemass were unfamiliar with Heavy Load, even though they were pioneers on the Swedish heavy metal scene. Thunderload Studios was a small studio with stone walls, and the subway passed just outside the door, so the trains kept interrupting the recordings. It is debated whether Kristian Weberyd's guitars was on the album. Kristian claims to have been there in the Thunderload Studios to record the album, but Mappe don't remember him being there. Kristian did however remember that he were in the studio and recorded the album without a vocalist, which was correct since Johan Länquist came into the picture towards the end of the recordings. Drummer Matz Ekström also confirms that Kristian was there while they recorded the album, but Mappe is certain that his guitar parts didn't end up on the album, since they asked session guitarist Klas Bergwall to come to the studio and lay some guitar solos on the record. So it was Klas Bergwall that played the lead guitars on the album, but maybe, just maybe, there are still some Kristian Weberyd guitars on the album. Kristian has said that he found it strange that he wasn't a member of the lineup, but instead on the thank list when the album finally came out. So maybe they erased his guitars, it's still something of a mystery. Mappe Björkman on the arrival of their vocalist Johan Länquist. That's quite some story. Johan Länquist never rehearsed with us. We got a record deal with Black Dragon and began recording the album. We didn't have him when we recorded the album, there was no singer. Matz knew Johan as an old friend in Jakobsberg. I remember that he mentioned that he knew this guy who was driving a taxi. Johan had kids already back then, so he was really busy. Anyway, he was into more polished music and didn't quite understand what we were doing. Finally, Matz got hold of him and asked him to sing on the album that we were making. He came to the studio and Leif showed him the songs that we had already recorded. It was like, "Hi, I'm Mappe, nice to meet you, sing please." But Johan wasn't just some random taxi driver, he had some experience going into the studio. He sang for the Stockholm-based heavy metal band Johan Länquist in the early 80s. Candlemass also tried to convince Johan Länquist to become a member of the band, but he wasn't interested in that. He had kids and a day job that kept him busy. There was also a certain Klas Bergwall that laid down the solos on Epicus Doomicus Metallicus. Mappe wasn't interested in recording the solos, so Leif gave a demo tape to his friend Klas Bergwall, who practiced the solos and then came down to the studio to record his parts, on top of what the band had already recorded. But just like Johan Länquist, Klas Bergwall wasn't interested in joining the band on a permanent basis. He ended up getting paid a pizza and 2 beers for his contributions to the album. But it wasn't just because they didn't get what Candlemass were doing. They were already a core of 3 people, Leif Edling, Mappe Björkman and Matz Ekström. And at the time they had no plans to play live or even doing a second record. The band's focus at the time was to make Epicus as good as they possibly could. There is also some keyboards on the album, like in the beginning of Demon's Gate. Those were played by Langquist, their producer. The track Solitude was written in the very last minute. They only had 5 songs and the album wasn't even 40 minutes long. So Leif wrote Solitude while being in the studio, but instead of putting it last, it became the intro track of the album and one of the band's most popular songs. Demon's Gate was the initial opener, but instead that one became the second song on side A. There was also the track Under the Oak, which was part of an idea that Leif had started writing at this point, a concept called Tales of Creation. But those ideas were pushed to the side, except Under the Oak that was perhaps too good to save for a possible second album. Mappe's favorite track on the album was Blackstone Wielder, and in that song Candlemass borrowed some riffs from an old Christmas carol called Star of Bethlehem. The skull on the cover of Epicus Doomicus Metallicus that has followed Candlemass through the years, on t-shirts, backdrops, guitars, stacked to the Sklomerata and whatnot, was actually the figurehead of the band even before the debut album came out. It was designed by drummer Matz Ekström's father, and it came to life already in 1985, and it was printed on the first ever band t-shirts. It is, however, unclear if anybody ever understood the message that the band tried to get across. The horned skull with the cross right through it might have looked like a stereotypical evil-looking album cover, but the idea was really to crucify the devil. Matz Ekström said, "I asked my father, who was really good at drawing, if he could do a skull for us. Then we got some nice ideas. Why having an ordinary skull? Make it look like a devil's skull and crucify him with a cross through the skull. We didn't want to be viewed as a black metal band. A little known fact amongst fans might be that Black Dragon Records actually made a huge mistake while pressing the album, because the skull turned out inverted. Matz Ekström continues, I saw that later they did a reissue of Epicus and the skull finally came out right, but on the original issue it was inverted. It made me completely mad when I saw it, but then they had already done the entire press run, and it was too late to do anything about it, says Matz Ekström. So in more recent presses of the album it has been turned back to what it was originally supposed to look like. The backside of the album was, however, in stark contrast to the dark front cover. We have two nameless alien-looking creatures that guards the passage that supposedly was the Demon's Gate. The back cover was painted by Black Dragon Records household painter Eric Larnoy. Eric who made cover art for bands such as Heir Apparent, Steel Vengeance, Druid, Chastain, Liege Lord and Manila Road to name a few. Eric was a very talented graphic artist that made the Black Dragon Records releases highly sought after albums for vinyl collectors. But unfortunately Eric passed away in 1996 at an age of 35. So rest in peace, Eric. Well, back to Candlemass. Epicus was finished and the boys were proud of their work, but somehow the reception was cold. Maybe due to Europe and their multi-million selling album The Final Countdown that was released less than 2 weeks earlier. So Epicus Doomicus Metallicus was released without much fanfare. Epicus did however get a 3 out of 5 rating in Kerrang, and it did alright in England, but overall the album wasn't an instant hit. It was actually so bad that the initial sales did not meet the label's expectations, and Candlemass were subsequently dropped from Black Dragon. Ironically, Epicus would prove to be Black Dragon's biggest seller over time, and it would ultimately be the album that kept the label going well into the 90s, simply because it kept selling. But in the long run, the split between Black Dragon Records and Candlemass was a net positive, due to the band finding a more stable lineup with fewer session musicians. And having a stable lineup was perhaps not the most important thing to the band early on, as they just wanted to get their debut album published. And what might come as a shock to some is that Candlemass didn't play live at all during this era, simply because their drummer Matz Ekström had a bit of a stage fright. He also had a full-time job that took up a lot of his time. So a few months after the release of Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, drummer Matz Ekström shockingly decided to leave the band. Matz was an integral part of Candlemass, not only for bringing Leif and Mappe together, he also knew Johan Länquist that did the vocals on Epicus. Matz was also the man behind the tagline Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, which was inspired by Black Sabbath's Hand of Doom, because at the time doom metal wasn't even a thing yet. So the party on Matz Ekström was of course a huge upset for the Candlemass camp. Matz did however continue playing drums, and for a short while he was in the Swedish doom metal band Count Raven. Worth noting is that when Matz Ekström left Candlemass, a certain Messiah Marcolin had already joined the band. But that's a topic for another episode. And if you enjoyed the first episode of the Candlemass Video Chronicles, then hit that like button and subscribe and all of that. Or why not become a Patreon if you think my content is worth supporting. I also want to do a shout out to Per-Ola Nilsson, Mattias Reinholdsson and John Gaffney for creating the Candlemass Chronicles magazine that this video series is based upon. And if you want to read those chronicles, then you can head over to ruthlessmetal.blogspot.com. And that's all for now, dear Doom Dancers, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in episode 2 of the Candlemass Video Chronicles. Cheers.
Beyond all nightmares I met my fate. An ancient passage surrounding my head. Scared I was, but with my hand